You're going to move on to what makes fungi such effective decomposers. Given enough time, fungi can turn even the hardest, most massive trees into soft soils. And they're able to do this because they have those thin hyphae and also the mycelium, which is the network of hyphae, has a large surface area. So this makes the nutrient absorption very efficient. Fungi are also able to grow towards dead tissues that supply their food. So if you remember saprophytic fungi, that means fungi that feed on dead plant material. So fungi are able to break down things like lignin with the use of an enzyme called lignin peroxidase. Okay. But fungi cannot grow with lignin as their food source. So they can't use the lignin itself, but they can use what's underneath the lignin, which is things like cellulose. So they use the enzyme lignin peroxidase to break down the lignin, and that gives them access to the cellulose that they use as a food source. Fungi also break down the cellulose with enzymes called cellulases, and they secrete these enzymes into the extracellular environment. The cellulases together convert cellulose into glucose that the fungi can absorb and use as a food source. So the main thing here is that fungi cannot absorb large molecules um, as they are. So what they do is they have to break down those large molecules like lignin or cellulose or starch, and they have to convert those into simple compound molecules. So things like sugars or um, proteins. I mean, no, sorry, not proteins. Nucleic acids. Proteins would be an example of a large molecule. Okay? So they have to turn s- things like starch, proteins, cellulose, and lignin into smaller compound molecules like the sugars and amino acids, okay, in order to absorb them. Fungi have evolved ways to reproduce as they diversified. So they can have swimming gametes and spores, a yolked hyphae in which the nuclei from different individuals fuse to form a zygosporangium inside a protective structure. They have specialized spore-producing cells like Basidia or Asci. So yolked hyphae means that the hyphae are kind of joined together. Yeah. The spores are the most fundamental reproductive cell in fungi. They are the dispersal stage in the life cycle, and this occurs both in sexual and and asexual reproduction. So if a spore falls on a food source and is able to germinate, uh, a mycelium will form. And as a fungus expands, the hyphae grows in the direction in which the food is most abundant. If the food begins to uh, become scarce, the spores will form and they're going to be dispersed by either the wind or animals. And this allows for the spores to find other resources that they can use. In some fungal lineages, the hyphae come in different mating types. rather than different sexes. So a hyphae of the same mating type will not combine during sexual reproduction. And in this way, the mating types function as sexes. Instead of having just two sexes, a single fungal species can have uh, thousands of sexes because they would have thousands of mating types. So how does the fertilization occur? There are several features that are unique to fungal fertilization. In some chytrids, they produce the gametes, okay, but these are not considered eggs and sperm. The male and the female gametes are motile, and the female gametes are only slightly larger than the male gametes. In all other lineages of fungi, fertilization occurs in two distinct steps that are separated by time and distances. There's the fusion of the hyphae, and there's the fusion of nuclei from those fused hyphae. The process of sexual reproduction begins when the hyphae from two different mating types fuse to form a hybrid cell. So that's called plasmogamy. That's when only the cytoplasms are fused at that point, not the nuclei. Okay. Then, when there's two or more genetically distinct nuclei exist within a single mycelium, it's called a heterokaryotic. Most heterokaryotic hyphae are dikaryotic, and they're divided by a septa. And each cell contains two haploid nuclei, one from each mating type. Karyogamy occurs when the nuclei fuse to form a diploid zygote. The nuclei produced by the karyogamy then divide by meiosis to produce the haploid spores. Most fungal species can reproduce asexually as well as sexually. There's a large number of Ascomycetes that have never been observed to produce sexually, so the asexual reproduction is the most common. The spore-forming structures are produced by a haploid mycelium, and spores are generated by mitosis. And so that way, the offspring are clones that are genetically identical to the parents. The microscopic spores are carried by wind, and this is an adaptation to life on land. So it allowed for the terrestrial fungi to disperse widely and to colonize different habitats. So here's an example of the life cycle of fungi. So they can reproduce both asexually and sexually. Um, they reproduce asexually when food resources are more plentiful, because in that way they want the offspring to have those same adaptations to the current environment, where they will continue to benefit from those resources, and they'll continue to be able to obtain those resources. If food sources are scarce, then the fungi are looking to reproduce sexually. And in that way, when they combine with a different mating type, the offspring will have a greater chance of, well, they're going to be more diverse, genetically diverse, and that will give them a better chance to uh, become adapted to the new environment. So the life cycle that we're going to look at is just the zygomycota life cycle, like the one we studied in lab. So there's four major types of life cycles. Among the sexually reproducing species of fungi, the presence of a heterokaryotic stage and morphology of spore-producing structures vary. So focusing on the zygomycete life cycle, also known as zygomycota, the sexually reproducing reproduction starts when the hyphae from different mating types fuse. And then the plasmogamy forms a spore-forming zygosporangium that develops a resistant coat. And inside the zygosporangium, the nuclei from the mating types fuse. And that's when karyogamy occurs. The mycelia can also reproduce asexually by making sporangia, which produce haploid spores by mitosis. And these spores are then dispersed by the wind. Okay, so here we have the life cycle of a zygomycetes. Okay, so here when we start, there's the two hyphae of the different mating types, and when they so these can sense the genetic diversity of another fungi through chemical signals. When they find a mating type that's different their than they are, then they'll look to reproduce sexually. So the two hyphae will join together, they'll fuse the cytoplasm, okay, but not the nuclei yet. So just the cytoplasm. So they're just connected at this point. Then the spores form in the reproductive structure that's called the zygosporangia. Okay. And then within the zygosporangia, you'll get the fusion of the nuclei through karyogamy, and then that's when you get the zygote, which is diploid. Then the zygote produces a spore-producing structure, which is going to be the sporangium to release the spores. Okay. And then the cycle will, then this one would develop into a mycelia, and as you know, the mycelia is composed of hyphae, so then the cycle can continue again. If it wants to reproduce sexually, the hyphae of the mycelia will look for a different mating type so that it can reproduce. So here's a video of the life cycle of a mushroom. So you can go ahead and take a look at that so that you can know the different life cycles, a different example of a life cycle. So now we're going to go into some key lineages of fungi. So to begin with, we'll start with the chytrids and the zygomycetes. So these are not considered monophyletic, and they should not be named as single lineages. But that's how they are currently, and that's mainly because there's still research that's being done on these groups, and as they continue to analyze data, um, mainly the DNA sequences, they're gonna they're looking to identify monophyletic groups um, within those uh, those lineages. Okay. Let's see. So so let's go to zygomycetes. So these are primarily soil dwellers. When the hyphae of opposite mating types grow near each other, they fuse during sexual reproduction and they form the thick-walled zygosporangium. But in this one, also asexual reproduction is also common. The saprophytic and parasitic members are responsible for rotting fruits and vegetables. So remember, saprophytic means that it feeds on dead plant material. Okay. Okay. So I'm mainly using these tables to show you the pictures. The information that I want you to know is just the information on the phyla that are given before the tables. Okay. So the next one is Glomerulomycota. So all of these members except for a single species, comprises the arbuscular mycorrhizae fungi, and these absorb phosphorus, nitrogen, and other nutrients, um, as well as water into roots of most plants that live in grasslands and tropical forests. And in exchange, the host plant provides the fungi with sugars and organic compounds. So here's the glomeromycota, and you can see the arbuscular mycorrhizal fungus that's penetrating the root here. For Basidiomycota, so these would be like the examples that you would see in like just mushrooms that grow above ground, or puffballs. So these form mycelia and produce basidia, where meiosis and spore formation occur. Mushrooms, like the ones that you're familiar with, are cultivated or collected from the wild as a food source. Uh, this group is capable of synthesizing lignin peroxidase, which is an important. Uh, it's important in the wood decomposition because without these fungi, um, if we had trees and once and they died, then nothing would be able to break down the lignin without the fungi. So that's why they're really important. They're really important to ecosystems because they're the only ones that are able to efficiently break down that tough lignin. And for Basidiomycota, some are ectomycorrhizal fungi that improve the health of forests, and some can also be parasitic. So here you can see a puffball releasing spores. Okay. But like I said, some examples of these are the mushrooms, uh, brackets, Ascomycota. Most form mycelia and produce spores and asci. Mycelia also commonly reproduce asexually. Oh, and by the way, the asci are reproductive structures. Single-celled yeasts are also part of the lineage. The yeasts reproduce when daughter cells pinch off, which is known as budding. So that's when they pinch off from a parent cell after mitosis. About half of the species grow in mutualistic association with either cyanobacteria or green algae. And when those two types of organisms combine, they form structures called lichens. And this association is also mutualistic. So the fungi get sugars from the green algae or cyanobacteria that they produce during photosynthesis. Okay? And exchange the the bacteria or the green algae get a moist place to live in, and also some kind of protection. Okay, so here's an example of a lichen on a branch. There's the lichen in cross section. For this group, many form mutualistic ectomycorrhizal associations with tree roots. Most they are the most common endophytic fungi that are above ground tissues or with above ground tissues. Many others are saprophytic and abundant on forest floors and in grassland soils. And then there's also some that are parasitic um, and there's others that are predatory because they feed on things like amoeba and small protists. Okay, so here you can see some of the examples are things like truffles, yeast, cup fungi, and the lichen forming fungi. All right, so that's the end of the fungi chapter. So we'll move on to the next topic.